welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today is going to be part 2 of my little mini-series on divisions. Before we dive into what we're going to talk about today, I just wanted to say the diapason episode is coming. I'm planning on doing it on Monday. All last week we had tornado watches in Tennessee, and then there was a stomach bug that went around, so it's been a little crazy. So we're going to have some back-to-back episodes here to kind of catch up. So that diapason episode with my sort of fake 9 course is going to be coming on Monday, and we'll talk about those exercises and things to help those of you who are working on those low bass courses. Today, I kind of wanted to divide the episode into 2 parts. The first part, I just want to talk a little bit about parallels and how we manage parallels, how important dealing with parallel octaves and fifths and intervals and things like that is, and how does that contribute to the style of the music, and what's over the line and what's not. And then the second half, we're going to talk about displacement. And I'll get into more details about what that is, and I'll give some more little assignments and ideas for improvising and for composing and things like that. So first, let's talk about parallels. And when we talk about parallels, we're primarily talking about parallel octaves and parallel fifths. So parallel octaves like C to C, B to B, C to C, D to D, E to E, having that in a row. Parallel fifths, of course, being things like G to D, E, B, things like that. And I think if you're taking an undergraduate music theory course, well, let me put it this way. I've run into 2 kind of viewpoints, and I think they come from very different areas. There is the music theory professor at a university teaching undergraduate counterpoint, and they're using Palestrina as a model and Fuchs from the late 17th and early 18th century, those individuals tend to be very, very much like parallels are bad. Do not do parallels, and we'll talk about different types of parallels and how to avoid them if we want to. And then the other group of people that I seem to run into are the ones who've done a lot of continuo playing. And they play a lot of continuo, and they just got to lay down a beautiful, lush chord underneath a singer in a recitative or in something like that. And they're like, parallels don't matter, whatever. Only losers and organists worry about parallels, da-da-da-da. And I think my experience reading through primary sources and reading through the huge amounts of repertoire. I've probably read thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces at this point. What I have actually seen is that there is a range. There is quite a range, a very significant range in terms of the use of parallels, the avoidance of parallels. So for example, I think the classic example is Palestrina, right? If you want an example of a high level vocal composer who is writing what we'd call pristine counterpoint with no parallels anywhere, no parallel fifths, no parallel octaves, Palestrina is a great example. But what about everything else? I mean, we can look at some very rustic pieces and we'll see parallels in them. And what does that mean? And then we'll look at dances and we'll notice, there's some parallels in the inner voices. So I wanted to maybe show you guys a couple of examples. I had one other one that just came to mind, and I want to see if I've got it with me, which is literally opens with, I don't think I have it in this folder, but, oh, no, I do. Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple of pieces and show you. Now, most of you are going to be aware of who John Doland was, and perhaps you know who Albert de Riep was. This first example comes from the first book of Lute songs, and it's Now, Oh Now, I Needs Must Part. And this is the song version of the Frog Galliard. And I chose this because it is a printed source. Doland had the opportunity to edit it, and I believe there were multiple editions, so he had the opportunity to make corrections if he wanted to. The opening, we have a G chord, followed by a D chord, followed by an E, followed by this sort of first inversion. Well, this is actually a B major chord when you add the voice part. B minor chord, sorry, and then C major. Okay, so we've got this chord progression, which doesn't sound too bad, right? This is lovely, you know, and here it is sort of in time. But let's play the alto or tenor voice with the bass. So let's do this from right from the beginning. So we've got perfect fifth, going to perfect fifth, going to perfect fifth, going to octave. So we've got 1, 2, 3 parallel, well, you know, 2 or 3 parallel fifths, depending on how you count it, right? So first parallel is here, second parallel is here. And then this is fine, and then parallel octave, B to B, C to C. Okay, that's really interesting. So you go, okay, did Dowland make a mistake? Was he a bad composer? No, not at all. I take it as here we have a song that is based upon a dance, and what I've noticed is when I play dance pieces in the repertoire, there is a tendency to allow more parallels and inner voices. And in this case, we have parallels in between the tenor voice and the bass voice. And I think that's just a great example. And of course, John Dolan was a brilliant composer, extremely well respected in his time, one of the maybe the greatest lute composer of the Renaissance. So if he can do it, obviously that is some opens the door to us being able to do it, right? Albert de Reep. This is from his Fantasy #1, and what I'm going to do is I'll just play the outer voices so it's super clear. This is about 315 measures into Fantasy 1, and for those of you who don't know who Albert de Reep was, he was the lutenist of Francois Premier, the King of France, and perhaps the second most important lute player after Francesco da Milano, who was the Pope's lutenist in the first half of the 16th century. This is really interesting. So we start off with C and E, third, totally fine. And then F and C, perfect fifth. And then G and D. Those are the outer voices. So I played the outer voices so you could really hear that. And this is not the only place in some of the other Albert de Reep fantasies I've found even parallel octaves. And this is somebody who clearly knew his counterpoint, brilliant, well-respected musician who was being courted by the highest levels of royalty in Europe, and he's throwing in parallels. And you go, well, what's going on here? Well, you know, you put this in context, and we have these beautiful, lush chords where he's just going like that, and I think what's going on is he's prioritizing the overall sound over that. He's making a decision. So we've got parallels sneaking into inner voices with Doland. We've got parallels sneaking into outer voices of Albert de Reep. There's this great example. This is a slightly later music. It's a bit later, but this is a Porsche, which is a sort of a Scottish piece. Sort of not really a prelude, but kind of. And literally, the opening is this. All parallel octaves. Okay? If you did any of these things in your undergraduate music theory class, your teacher would take out the red pen and just start marking things off. And you'd be, 70%, 65%. You didn't learn anything. And that's simply because they're sort of, one, it's simplified, and two, they're using Fuchs as a model, which is Fuchs was a 17th century composer, and so to say late 17th century, early 18th century theorist and composer and thinker of music, and he came up with this sort of method of breaking down what is essentially Palestrina's style of counterpoint, and called species counterpoint. This is what's often taught in colleges and universities. And this is very, very, very strict counterpoint. Palestrina was very strict about his handling of parallels. And what can happen is we have this perception that, oh, that's all Renaissance music. But when you actually start playing Renaissance music and you start reading treatises from the period, so for example, Zarlino, which is actually his musical theoretical treatise, is actually from the 16th century. He's actually a 16th century theorist. He says in his treatise that the as long as the structural elements are not parallel, you can put stuff in between, and I'll explain that a little more in just a couple minutes. But there's a variety, and then of course you have Doland, who's putting parallels in dance movements. So what does that mean for you as the composer, as the improviser, as the modern person who's trying to approach this music? And I think it can be challenging because as a composer, I've written a number of pieces. I often feel pressured to be especially clean, to really watch out for my parallels, because I've always been terrified that somebody's going to be like, Laudon, I found a parallel fifth in your music, and clearly you don't understand Renaissance counterpoint and all of that. And I actually, this is a little embarrassing. I have a drawer where I have a list of spots in my music that are a little suspect. But what I've done is I've gone and found examples from surviving repertoire, and I've written them down. So in case somebody calls me on it, I could say, oh, yes, but Dolan did this in this piece, and Albert de Riep did it in this piece, and Milano did it in this piece. And I should say, if you want an example of a very, very clean lute counterpoint composer, Francesco da Milano is very good. You can find parallels if you look hard enough in his music, but clearly that was important to him. Going through, part of it is the surviving repertoire of his we have, and we'll talk about when we want to be perhaps more strict about parallels and less. So for you, what is the right amount of strictness? Well, if we're thinking about genre and you're doing a country dance, I think you can get away with more parallels. I think that sort of bumpkin, goofy flavor plays into that genre of music. So if you're doing a brawl du village, or any other kind of brawl, to be honest, or some other village dance, or some little kind of quirky thing, of course, having a few parallels in there kind of adds to the character, and we see that in the sources. But if you're doing a high level contrapuntal fantasy with imitative counterpoint, and you see this with Dowland as well, his counterpoint tightens up in his fantasies. So he's a little looser in his dances, and then it really tightens up in the fantasies. And so I think if I had to go from strictness, it would be least strict, sort of village dances, brawls, maybe jigs, some jigs and things like that, especially if you want to really have that kind of rustic character. And then into the sort of the more formal dances, pavans and galliards, I might be a little more careful. I might make sure if you have parallels that they're in the inner voices, that maybe they're between bass and tenor, bass and alto, alto and tenor. And then if you're a composer, or even if you're improvising, I suppose, and you're doing contrapuntal ricercares or fantasies, then we get a little more strict, I think, if you want to capture the flavor. Now, for the improvisers, what I would say, the sense that I get from looking at ground-based pieces and hearing about improvisation in general and reading about improvisation in the 16th and early 17th century is there's a sense that you get a little more leeway. And I think that makes sense, right? If you've got somebody who's improvising, like a Bergamasca, like I was playing at the beginning, you're just doing your little Bergamasca here, and you're doing some stuff over it. To be able to, and then of course if the accompanist starts doing interesting things, if they change the voicings of the chords, if they're just feeling like they want to, instead of doing the B flat here, they decide they're going to do it there, being able to predict that becomes harder and harder and harder. So I think there's leeway for improvisation. I think particularly with having parallels and inner voices, I think a good goal in general for everybody is to try to avoid parallels in the outer voices. And then if you are a composer, and especially if you're writing ricercares and contrapuntal fantasies and maybe vocal polyphony, let's say you go beyond the lute, you want to do vocal polyphony, I think in those cases you're going to want to be a lot more strict. Now, how strict do we need to be? So let me get back to that Zarlino quote that I mentioned earlier, which is that as long as the structural points are good, then you are fine. Now, what does that mean? So let me give you an example. Let's do like E and C, right? We've got a sixth, and then we're going to go to F and F, an octave. So let's say this is beat 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now going from a sixth to an octave is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They're both going up and one of them's a leap, whatever. Again, that's very strict species counterpoint. We don't need to worry about that for now. But let's say, so there's no parallels there, but what if I were to add a division? Now what just happened? So I have E in the bass, C on top, and I go D, E, F, and F. Now the interesting thing that happens is that last note in the division I hit is an E. So technically speaking, I've got an E in the bass, and I've got an E on top, and that's going F to F. So we've got what we sometimes call a hidden octave. Now, when Zarlino says that as long as the structural points are good, as long as there are no parallels in the structural points, you don't need to worry about the divisions. Now, that's very, very freeing. What does that mean if you want to imitate Palestrina? It's not going to sound as close to Palestrina, right? So if you want to be like Palestrina and you want to be super strict, you need to look for those as well. And this is in particular to the people out there who want to be composers. So if you're writing a division and you're going, or you're writing a piece and you've got a segment like this, and you're EC going to F and F, and I know it's not the most brilliant little example, but let's just stick with it. So we've got E and C, and we've got F and F, and you decide, okay, but I want to fill that gap. I don't like that leap, so I'm going to go E and C, D, E, F and F, and you go, oh, you know what? I want a stricter style of counterpoint. I'm trying to write a contrapuntal fantasy, or I'm trying to imitate Palestrina, or one of the really, really strict vocal composers. And they weren't all super strict. For example, if you get to the end of the 16th century, you'll start noticing, especially at cadences, parallels popping in. And there are these hilarious correspondences between English theorists and English composers as they're getting these madrigals from Italy, and they're going, what's with these parallels at these cadences? It must be a printing error. And clearly it just wasn't. They weren't too worried about it in Italy. But let's say you want to be stricter. You want this like super clean counterpoint. How do we deal with this? Well, you could change the division. You could certainly just change the division and not do that division. You could do something completely different where, you might be able to do something like, end up on G. So we have a third there. You could leap up. Or let's say you want to keep that division. You really like that stepwise motion because, the leaps, you're kind of, I don't like that. So what we're going to do is add a bass note. And all I did was I've got E and C, open D, and now it's C and E, F to F. So I just got rid of that parallel there. Is that something my improvisers need to worry about? No, please don't. If you're worried about hidden octaves while improvising a Bergamasca, I think you've missed the point. There's definitely leeway. Even in the written versions of grounds and trebles, you'll find some parallel activity, and it just I think it'll end up making your playing way too stodgy. But if you're a composer, if you're sitting down and you have the chance to really craft and think about this stuff, you can make that decision. How strict do I want to be with my counterpoint? So what is my overall message here? My overall message is when it comes to parallels, there's a range. And we want to think about, are you trying to imitate a particular composer? Are you trying to match the sound to a particular genre? It's not as simple as parallel octaves are bad, parallel fifths are bad, don't ever do them. Or who cares about parallel octaves and parallel fifths? Let's just make music and feel things. I would recommend that for 99% of you, the general thought should be, hey, let's avoid parallels in the outer voices, unless you're trying to imitate, for example, like a Scottish push or something like that, or you're really trying to make it kind of country, sort of, you're just being goofy and you're playing around a little bit. But I think a good place to start is, let's make sure those outer voices, we don't have any parallels happening in those. It's a nice level of strictness. And then you can either dial it up or dial it down depending on the sound you want. One thing I've noticed playing through thousands and thousands of lute pieces at this point is it is amazing how many things they tried out. And some of those things end up sounding ridiculously modern. In fact, there's a Ricercar in the Caparola lute book toward the end. I think it's either it's like the last or second to last. It's an F, and it's literally got like a melody in the opening that sounds like a Paul McCartney tune. And I think to myself, if I wrote that, somebody would accuse me of sounding modern. So it's this interesting problem, right? We need to eliminate parallels as much as possible so that we sound like we're playing in a Renaissance style. But clearly they sometimes had parallels. They broke the rules. So it's just that tricky balance of taste. And do the parallels sound good? Do they sound bad? Are they interfering with the music? And I mean, clearly the parallels in the beginning of Now, Oh Now, I Needs Must Part have not ruined that piece. It's a great lute song. People have been playing it for a very, very long time. I adore it. Albert de Riep is one of my favorite composers. Doland is obviously one of my favorite composers. So just think about the parallels, set some bounds for yourself, and then try to follow those bounds. And I think a good place to start is avoiding those outer voice parallels. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about today was displacement. Displacement. In our last episode on divisions, we were talking about taking divisions and keeping each note from the unornamented version in the same place rhythmically. So let me sort of show you what I mean. So let's say we had something like let's keep it simple. We're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, right? We've got A on 1, we've got B flat on 3. If I want to keep everything, but I want to add a division, I can just go 1, 2, and 3, 4. Simple, right? And we were playing around with maybe adding more complicated divisions, whatever, but those notes still land where we're expecting in the measure from the unornamented version. Now, displacement is really more about a 3-note relationship. So, for example, we have, let's say we're looking at an unornamented line. We'll use the same notes here. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So we got A, B flat, C. A is on 1, B flat is on 3, C is on 1. And let's say I did something like, now if I count that for you, you'll see that I went 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1. So B flat has now been moved to beat 4. So we've got this, this important note that has now been displaced off where it was in the unornamented version, and that is really, really common. It's just as common as having the note exactly where it landed before, and we can play around, we can make it, more complicated. You could add other little divisions like that, and go through. So it's very common to see this second note in a setting of 3. Now we'll get into more. It's so hard because I want to kind of break this up for you guys and not like jump ahead, because in my brain I'm going, oh yeah, this is going to really help you guys with broken style, and we're going to do an episode on broken style, and I'll tell you a little about it here in a second. But I want to get my point across as clearly as I can here. And I mean, it could be very simple. You could have the unornamented version be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then the ornamented version is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So just a delay. And presumably, of course, you could also have the harmonies match that, right? The harmonies would follow the melody, and we see that all the time. You see it in pavans and galliards and things like that, where a note will be displaced. And in a future episode, we'll also just talk about eliminating that note. I mean, you could have a situation where you just go 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1. Wait, where'd that B flat go? Right? So, and we'll get into that because, like I said, we're going to, you just, when you read through thousands of lute pieces, you realize they did all sorts of stuff, and some of the most advanced sort of divisions just throw all the rules out, and you maybe the first note of the measure is the same as the unornamented version, and then the first note of the next measure is the same, but everything in between is different. And you will see that, and we'll talk about that down the road. So displacement is just when we take a note and we move where it is going to be played in the measure. Now, in general, this is not a hard rule, but in general, it tends to be placed later. So what do I mean by that? So for example, we'll stick with this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, right? In general, I don't see as often, not 100%, but 9 times out of 10, you're not going to see something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So getting there early. I'm already thinking of exceptions. So it does happen, but the more common thing is to actually play the note a little later, especially as part of a division. If you were to do something like, yeah, that's a nice one. So you've got that. So you go 1, 2, E, and a 3, and 4, and a 1, right? And so everything's kind of been displaced, and it's part of that division as you go up. And you could be really extreme about it. You could go, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. That's generally a little more rare to have a strong beat note. So it was on beat 3, right? And then now suddenly it's on an and the first time you get that B flat. But it happens. It happens. So as much as I'd like to categorize this and break it down to well, there's this type of division, this type of division, there really is at a point the rules start to break down in between beat 1 of a measure and beat 1 of the next measure. And obviously, as you're thinking about this, you could totally put it in 3, right? You could go 1, 2, and a 3. Yeah, 1, 2, and a 3, 1, right? Or 3 and a 1 if you want to add a little something there. 3 and a 1. Yeah, that's a nice one too. I love that. You could do this. 1, 2, and a 3, 3 and a 1. 1, 2, and a 3 and a 1. And build a series of divisions, even within what you're already learning with your more basic ones. Okay, so as a little preview, this idea of displacement actually becomes really important when we start talking about broken styles. Now, some of you may be aware of something called style brisé, which is a sort of a French-specific broken style, but if we look at English music, Italian music, French music as well, toward the end of the 16th century, we start seeing these broken styles. And I'll just give you we're going to go into this in much greater depth, but because it relates to displacement, I just wanted to mention it. So, for example, let's say I have a series of thirds, something like, here, let's just do, okay? And, that's very lovely. But let's say I want to spice it up a little bit, make it a little more interesting. I might do something like, let's do this. Or even, that might be kind of fun, right? You just start breaking it up, and then suddenly you go, oh, this thing that was just a series of parallels, I really like this. And you'll see I can also displace bass notes. So for example, and we will have a future episode where I talk about doing divisions across voices, so managing multiple voices. But here's a little preview. So we've got these thirds, right? Okay, so let's kind of take what I was already doing and play around with a little bit. So I play my G. So here's the first third. I break it. What? So let's put this in time for you guys so you can follow along. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Okay, and one of the cool things that I did there, which you'll see, is you can also displace the bass note. So I didn't put this down, this bass note, the E, on beat 3. I actually put the melody note there. And one of the other things that's going to come up when we talk about making broken styles and making it just not sound like an arpeggio, because of course you could do this and just make it sound like an arpeggio. And that, they did that. They absolutely did that. And you'll find examples of it. But if you want something that sounds a little bit more like two active voices, what's nice is to sneak in a little bit of that stepwise motion. So for example, this little, that's kind of nice, right? And then of course you can add divisions like I was doing before. You do something like, that time I put the bass note in time and I delayed the melody note. You could do, add more divisions as you go. And then in terms of bass divisions, one thing that I'll advise you is if you've got two voices and you're doing bass divisions, it's really nice to, I think, to keep the upper voices relatively simple. So for example, if I've got C and E, and I'm going to D and F. So we're doing thirds, right? Because thirds are really very common, just like our six that we were doing before with this. So we've got our third, C and E, go to D to F. If I were doing, something simple, I might just go, right? Just going, so I've got C and E, and then I go B, C, and I go, and I might make that a little more complicated. I could do something like, and we can continue that. Let's say I add another third to this, so we could go, and then you can make patterns like that, right? Of course. Things like that where the bass, but you'll notice that the upper voice is staying relatively still. It's kind of keeping its own pattern. But from here, we could build something off of this. So we do something like, I think I would want to do it the other way. Let's try it the other way. So something like, and that's kind of cool. And then we just keep going on thirds or something like that and make our way back down, and then cadence. So once we start adding and playing around with two voices, that's going to be lots of thirds and lots of sixes and things like that. For my improvisers, the people who are playing over grounds, you're maybe, and I know it's only been a couple weeks, so you're probably not totally comfortable yet, but just to throw some ideas at you, I talked about, let's make sure that we're always on the third of the chord when you land. So for example, if I'm doing a Bergamasca and you're playing the treble part, the first chord is maybe F, so you want to land on A, right? And then you get to B, you're going to want to land on D, well, just B flat, D, and then when you get to C, you're going to want to land on E. So it's probably going to end up being, and then when you're ready to be done, you perform, you do an octave. Now, one thing, if you want to start shaking that up a little bit, the trick, the one trick that I really liked a lot when I was doing a lot of the improvising on the grounds was you just alternate a perfect interval with a third. What do I mean by that? So let's say your first chord in a Bergamasca is an F major chord. So maybe at the beginning, I'm just going 1, 2, and 3, and so I started with that octave, 1, 2, and 3, and 1, and then now I'm on a third, right? So now that I'm on a third, I can now follow that with another perfect interval. And we know that my next chord is going to be C major. So I could land on a C, which is nice because it's really close, right? 1 and 2 and 3, 1. So we've got this, which is very good. So octave. So 1 and 2 and 3, or 1, 2 and 3 and third. Octave. So octave, third, fifth, third, octave, third, fifth, third. And what we're eventually building up to is you can, as long as you do something different than what you did before, you're totally fine. So for example, once you're comfortable with that, if you start off going 1, let's say 1 and 2 and 3 and 1, you're on the fifth. Now you didn't move, and of course that's kind of nice in that context. But let's say you're on the fifth on a B flat, and we now can either go to a third over the C chord, or we can go to an octave. So you could totally do something like, which is kind of nice. That's totally fine. So obviously, again, it's only been like 2 weeks since I put out the first video. So continue to just land on thirds over those chords if you need to. But as you get more and more comfortable, what you can do is you can alternate some sort of parallel, some sort of perfect interval, perfect octave or perfect fifth above the bass, and then do a third. And then do a perfect interval, and then do a third. So you're just always kind of resetting with that third. And then once you're really comfortable with that, you just make sure it's something different than what you did before, or it's thirds in a row. Because of course you could totally go, like I just showed you, right? You could go fifth to octave or octave to fifth. If I'm going, I've got my octave here, and I want to get up there, 1 E and a 2 E and 3, you could do something like that. And then you're fine, right? There we go. That way it's at least in 3, right? 1 E and a 2 and 3 and. So we start with the octave, and we end up with the fifth. Now that's a big gap, and I wouldn't necessarily consider that. Well, actually, in the context of a treble bass, you have these big runs that go up and down, so that's not so bad. If I were doing a solo piece, I would kind of, boy, that's a, going up that whole octave in such a short period of time is a little bit out of character. Not unheard of, but a little out of character. So, just to recap, if you are one of my composer people who's interested in composition, or you're looking at, let's say, unornamented dance movements and you want to add movements, you can now start thinking about displacement. And displacement is when you just take one of those original notes and you rhythmically move it to somewhere else in the measure. That tends to work it's a little easier to do that from a compositional standpoint. But on the other hand, like if you're working on your divisions, you can sort of build that in as well as an improviser. And then for my improvisers, if you're comfortable now improvising over these grounds and just landing on the third above the bass on every downbeat, you can start alternating now. And I think that is really going to open up a lot of things. And again, if you end up doing parallel fifths or something like that, who cares? At the end of the day, who's gonna get you? But I do think it's a great thing to strive for. If you're playing your Bergamasca and you go, okay, right, B flat to F, C to G. All right. You made a boo-boo. Move on. Some people put it in writing. I wouldn't get too hung up. Don't let it make your playing too stodgy. Like, just keep it in mind as something to be aware of. Coming up, like I said, I'm going to do the Diapason episode on Monday. And then I think the next episode on divisions is going to talk a little bit more. I know I touched on it a bit today, but sort of distributing divisions between voices. And we'll talk about, like, today we were talking a little bit like these 3 voice things, and then sort of how and where to put divisions. And the short answer to that is going to be anywhere you want and anywhere that sounds good. But I'm going to provide examples and some ideas for people to play around with. And then I think the episode after that is really going to take the guardrails off, and I'll pull out some examples of situations where they just take the original unornamented section and completely like shotgun it and do something wacky in between. Things like Daniel Batchelor. Actually, some of Dowlin's pieces, he really does some off the wall divisions that don't necessarily fit into some of the categories we talked about. So lots of stuff coming up. If you have any questions, please throw them in the comment section. This is obviously the sort of thing that's way easier to do when I have somebody sitting across from me or sitting with me, and we can kind of play around and goof around and do things together and test things out. But hopefully this gives you another thing to play around with. In particular, this idea that you can displace a note, and in fact, it's going to be an essential element of some other ornamented techniques that we're going to work on. And it's so funny too, like, you know, sitting here and I was thinking to myself, well, we don't want it to sound like an arpeggio. And then, you know, if we add in saying, and I think to myself, oh my gosh, John Johnson did that, one of his pavans. They did everything, and it's kind of cool. And so we'll continue with this. I hope you have a wonderful week. Happy looting, happy practicing. Toss those questions in the comment section. If you're enjoying the channel so far, the best way you can support me is by becoming a subscriber. I also have my Patreon link in the description. I'll look forward to talking about diapasons in our next episode. Have a great one. Bye-bye.